The stagecoach lurched to a stop in Willow Creek, dust swirling around Margaret O'Brien's carefully pressed traveling dress. 3 days from Missouri, 27 years of waiting, and 6 months of letters had led to this moment. She spotted Harold Brennan immediately tall, well-dressed, standing apart from the crowd. His photograph hadn't captured the coldness that crossed his face when he saw her. "Miss O'Brien," his voice carried across the platform, thin as winter ice. "Mr. Brennan." She clutched her carpet bag, her mother's cameo brooch trembling at her throat. His eyes traveled over her fuller figure, lingering with undisguised disappointment. "You're not what I expected. Your letter suggested someone more refined." The crowd pretended not to watch. Harold placed $20 on a nearby barrel. "For return fare," he said, turning away. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Margaret stood alone in the settling dust, her dreams as scattered as the blown sage. "Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story." Margaret sat on the edge of the horsehair mattress in her hotel room, spreading her remaining money across the faded quilt. $27.50. The 20 from Harold, she couldn't bring herself to think of it as anything but blood money plus the $7.50 she'd kept for emergencies. The hotel would want $4 for tonight. Breakfast would be another 50 cents if she dared show her face in the dining room. The porcelain wash basin and pitcher stood on the dresser, mocking her with their delicate painted roses. She'd imagined washing her face in Harold's home with such fine things, preparing for their life together. Now the water in the pitcher had gone cold, like everything else in her world. $23 after the hotel. The return stage fare to Missouri cost $35. She was trapped. Margaret pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. She'd used up her tears in the first hour, great gulping sobs that had surely carried through the thin walls. Now she felt hollow, scraped clean like a butter churn. Morning came whether she wanted it or not. Pride forced her downstairs to the dining room she'd paid for breakfast. After all, the room fell quiet when she entered, then buzzed with whispers. She took a corner table, keeping her eyes on the blue willow china plate before her. "Coffee, dear." Margaret looked up into the kindest brown eyes she'd ever seen. The woman pouring coffee was perhaps 60, wearing a severe gray dress with a pristine white apron. Her face bore the deep lines of someone who'd smiled through sorrow. "Thank you," Margaret managed. "I'm Ruth Holloway. I run this dining room and the restaurant next door." The woman's voice carried a gentle Quaker plainness. "Thou seems troubled, child." The unexpected "thou" nearly undid Margaret's composure. "I'm fine, Mrs. Holloway. Just Ruth, dear, and thou is not fine." Ruth set down the coffee pot and, without invitation, settled into the opposite chair. "I saw what happened yesterday at the stage. Harold Brennan is a fool, but that's no reflection on thee." Margaret's hands trembled around the coffee cup. "I can't afford to get home. Missouri. Yes, my family. They won't want me back. Not after this." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "They said I was too old, too plain, too particular. This was my chance, and I've ruined it." Ruth's weathered hands covered Margaret's trembling ones. The touch was warm, solid, real. "Pride goeth before a fall, but kindness lifts us up again. I have need of help at my restaurant. The work is hard but honest, room and board, plus $2 a week." Margaret stared at her. "You don't even know me. I know thou needs work, and I need hands. My last girl ran off with a traveling merchant." Ruth smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Besides, I have a sense about people. Thou has a good heart and strong hands. That's all I require. I don't know what to say." "Say thou will come see the place before deciding." Ruth stood, smoothing her apron. "Finish thy breakfast. I'll wait." An hour later, Margaret stood in the kitchen of Holloway's dining house, breathing in the yeasty smell of sourdough starter. The cast-iron cook stove dominated one wall, its surface gleaming with careful maintenance. Copper pots hung from hooks, and shelves lined with preserves stretched to the ceiling. "The work starts at 4:30, Ruth explained, tying a muslin apron around Margaret's waist. "Biscuits first, then bacon and eggs as folks come in. Lunch is the big meal stew or roast. Vegetables, pie, supper's lighter. Can thou cook? I raised 6 younger siblings after Mama died." "Then thou knows work." Ruth showed her the narrow stairs. "Thy room would be up here." The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the main street, an iron bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a rag rug on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had 5 minutes ago. "Why?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Why would you help me?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. 23 years ago, I stood where thou stands now, different circumstances, same desperation. Someone offered me a chance, now I offer one to thee." She turned back to Margaret, businesslike again. "We'll start with something simple. Show me thy biscuits." Margaret tied the apron tighter and moved to the stove. Her hands remembered the motions, cutting lard into flour, adding buttermilk, kneading just enough. Ruth watched, occasionally nodding approval, as the biscuits baked, filling the kitchen with warmth. Margaret felt something she hadn't expected to feel again, possibility. Not the grand dreams she'd carried from Missouri, but something smaller, quieter, the chance to earn her way, to stand on her own feet. "They smell perfect," Ruth said, and for the first time since stepping off that stage, Margaret smiled. Margaret woke in darkness, the unfamiliar room momentarily frightening until she remembered Ruth Holloway's restaurant, her new life. The small clock on the washstand showed 4:15. She dressed quickly in her second-best dress, a brown calico that wouldn't show stains, and made her way down the narrow stairs. Ruth was already in the kitchen, the kerosene ceiling lamp casting a warm glow over the workspace. "Good morning, dear. The coffee's on." The familiar routine of cooking steadied Margaret's nerves. She mixed biscuit dough while Ruth fried thick slabs of bacon. The coffee grinder's rhythmic cranking filled the quiet morning, and soon the kitchen smelled like heaven itself. By 5:30, they had biscuits in the warming oven, gravy simmering, eggs ready to fry to order. "First customers arrive at 6, Ruth said, checking the slate menu board. "Ranchers, mostly. They eat hearty and tip fair if thou treats them well." The bell above the door jangled, and Margaret's stomach clenched. 3 men entered, their boots heavy on the plank floor. They settled at a table near the window, hanging their hats on the pegs. "That's Josiah Mills and his sons," Ruth whispered. "Been coming here 10 years. Josiah's particular about his eggs over easy, not a bit of run." Margaret approached with the coffee pot, proud that her hands barely shook. "Morning, gentlemen. Coffee?" Josiah Mills looked up, his weathered face creased with permanent squint lines. "You're the new girl, the one Brennan sent for." Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm Margaret O'Brien. I work for Mrs. Holloway now." "Good. Ruth needs the help." He pushed his cup forward. "Black, hot as hell and strong as sin." His sons chuckled, and Margaret found herself almost smiling as she poured. She took their orders: eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy, and retreated to the kitchen. "Don't let them rattle thee," Ruth said, expertly flipping eggs. "Men gossip worse than women, but they forget faster too." The breakfast rush taught Margaret the rhythm of the place. The bentwood chairs scraped constantly as ranchers and townsmen came and went. She learned to balance multiple plates. Remember who wanted pepper jelly with their biscuits, who took cream in their coffee. Some customers avoided eye contact. Clearly they'd heard about yesterday's humiliation. Others, like the banker's wife, were surprisingly kind. "Don't you pay Harold Brennan any mind, Mrs. Patterson said, pressing an extra dime into Margaret's hand. "He's been putting on airs since he got that promotion at the land office. You're better off." At 8:30, when the rush slowed, a lone man entered. He moved quietly, choosing the corner table furthest from the window. Margaret noticed his clothes were clean but worn, his dark hair neatly trimmed but unfashionably long. When she approached with coffee, he looked up with the deepest brown eyes she'd ever seen. "Coffee, sir." "Please, black." His voice was low, roughened like he didn't use it much. "And whatever's easiest for breakfast. We have biscuits and gravy. Eggs. Biscuits are fine." He pulled out a battered book, effectively ending the conversation. She brought his food, noticed how he ate slowly, methodically, his attention split between the book and occasional glances around the room. When she returned to refill his coffee, she saw the title, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. "More coffee?" He nodded, then surprised her by asking, "You're new. Started today. You're doing fine." The words were simple, but something in his tone made them feel substantial. He left exact change plus a nickel tip, touched his hat brim, and left without another word. "That's Daniel Sawyer," Ruth said when Margaret returned to the kitchen. "Lost his wife 2 years back. Keeps to himself. But he's good people." The lunch crowd brought new challenges. The menu expanded to include pot roast, boiled potatoes, green beans from Ruth's garden preserves. Margaret's feet ached. Her back protested, but she kept moving. When Josiah Mills returned for lunch, she had his coffee poured before he asked. "This cornbread," he said suddenly, making her freeze mid-step. "You make this?" "Yes, sir. It's better than Ruth's." He said it loud enough for the kitchen to hear. "Got more corn flavor, less sweet, the way it ought to be." Margaret felt a genuine smile stretch across her face for the first time since stepping off that stage. "Thank you, Mr. Mills?" "Josiah," he corrected. "And I'll have another piece." By the time the supper dishes were washed and the kitchen cleaned, Margaret could barely stand. She collapsed in a chair while Ruth tallied the day's receipts. "Thou did well," Ruth said, marking figures in her ledger. "Better than most first days I've seen." "My feet don't agree," Ruth laughed, a warm sound that filled the kitchen. "They'll toughen. Everything does, given time." She closed the ledger and looked at Margaret directly. "I should tell thee something. What I said this morning, about someone giving me a chance, it was more than that." Margaret waited, sensing the weight of coming words. "I came west with my husband, full of dreams. He died of cholera 3 months after we arrived, leaving me with nothing but debt. I was going to—" Ruth paused, choosing words carefully. "I was going to take a position at the Silver Dollar. The kind of position desperate women take." The meaning was clear. Margaret reached across the table, touching Ruth's hand. "The woman who owned this restaurant then, Mrs. Brennan Harold's aunt, ironically offered me work instead. Honest work. When she died 5 years later, she left me the place." Ruth squeezed Margaret's fingers. "I've been paying that kindness forward ever since. I don't know how to thank you. By staying, at least through winter. The passes close by December, and I could use steady help until spring." Margaret thought of her family in Missouri, who'd celebrated when Harold's proposal arrived. Thought of returning in shame. Then thought of Josiah Mills' gruff compliment, of the coins in her apron pocket, honest wages for honest work. "I'll stay through winter," she agreed. "Maybe longer." Ruth smiled. "Good. Now, there's leftover pot roast. Eat something before thou falls over." As Margaret ate, she gazed through the gingham curtains at Willow Creek's dusty main street. Somewhere out there, Harold Brennan probably sat in his comfortable house, congratulating himself on avoiding a mistake. Let him. She had work, shelter, and something she hadn't expected, the beginning of self-respect. Tomorrow she'd rise at 4:15 again, make biscuits and coffee, serve men who might whisper about her story. But she'd also serve good food, earn her wages, and slowly, carefully, build a new life from the ashes of her old dreams. The copper kettles gleamed in the lamplight as she climbed the stairs to her small room. Through her window, she could see stars beginning to appear over the prairie. Not the life she'd planned, but perhaps, just perhaps, the life she needed. 3 weeks into her new life at Holloway's dining house, Margaret had learned the rhythms of Willow Creek's hunger. Ranchers at dawn, shopkeepers at noon, families in the evening. She knew who wanted their eggs runny, who took extra pepper on everything, who always asked for yesterday's pie because they preferred it settled. But of all the patterns she'd memorized, Daniel Sawyer's was the most precise. Every morning at 8:30, after the breakfast rush, he'd enter through the door with barely a sound. Always the same corner table, back to the wall, facing the room, always the worn leather book in his jacket pocket, always black coffee, 2 cups exactly, and something simple to eat: biscuits, sometimes flapjacks, never anything that required much fuss. Margaret found herself watching for him, though she couldn't say why. He wasn't like the other men who came alone, the drummers passing through with their loud stories, or old Murphy who wanted conversation with his coffee. Daniel Sawyer seemed to exist in his own quiet sphere, observing everything while revealing nothing. "You're staring," Ruth said one morning, catching Margaret peering through the kitchen door. "I'm not." Margaret's cheeks flushed. "I was checking if he needed more coffee." Ruth's knowing look was worse than words. "Daniel's been coming here since before Sarah passed. Quieter now. Though, she was the talker in that marriage." Margaret returned to kneading bread dough, putting unnecessary force into it. "I wasn't asking." "Of course not." Ruth smiled. "But I'll tell thee anyway. Sarah was my friend. Fever took her quick. 2 winters back. Daniel blamed himself. He was out checking cattle. Couldn't get back through the storm in time. Wasn't his fault. But guilt doesn't listen to reason." Through the serving window, Margaret could see Daniel reading, his coffee cup empty. She grabbed the pot and headed out before she could think too much about it. "More coffee. Mr. Sawyer." He looked up, and she was struck again by how his eyes seemed to really see her, not through her or around her like most customers. "Please." "And it's just Daniel." She poured carefully, noting his book was different today. "Not Marcus Aurelius." His eyebrows rose slightly. "You noticed?" "I read some of it once. My father had a copy." She didn't mention it was the only book besides the Bible in their house, or that she'd memorized whole passages during long winters. "It's Emerson today." He turned the worn cover so she could see. "Different kind of philosophy. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment," she quoted without thinking. Now his surprise was evident. "You've read Emerson. The schoolmaster back home lent me books sometimes." She shifted the coffee pot to her other hand, aware of other customers waiting. "I should, of course." But as she turned away, he added, "It's a good quote, especially for someone starting over." She froze for a heartbeat, then continued to the next table. He hadn't said it unkindly, but the observation rattled her. She'd thought she was becoming invisible, just another fixture in the restaurant. But Daniel Sawyer was watching her as much as she watched him. The lunch rush provided distraction from her unsettled thoughts. The oilcloth table covers needed constant wiping. The mason jars of preserves on each table needed refilling, and someone had to work the carved wooden pepper mill for Mrs. Henderson, whose arthritis prevented her from turning it herself. Daniel left during the busiest part, as always. Exact change plus a nickel tip, a touch to his hat brim, and gone. But when Margaret cleared his table, she found something besides coins, a small penciled note that read, "The door to the kitchen sticks. I could fix it if you'd like. D." She showed it to Ruth, who laughed. "That door's been troublesome for 3 years. If he wants to fix it, let him." 2 days later, during the slow afternoon hour between lunch and supper, Daniel appeared with a toolbox. He didn't announce himself, just went to work on the kitchen door while Margaret and Ruth prepared evening bread. The scrape of his plane on wood provided steady rhythm to their work. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said, bringing him coffee. I don't do anything I don't want to. He tested the door's swing, then resumed planing. Besides, I've watched you struggle with it every morning. Seems unnecessary. You've watched. She stopped, flustered. He glanced up, a hint of amusement in his eyes. I notice things, like how you always give the bigger portions to the old folks who probably can't afford seconds, or how you slip extra biscuits to the widow Martinez's boys. That's just kind, he finished. It's kind. The smell of saddle soap and wood shavings filled the space between them. His spurs jangled softly as he shifted position, testing the door again. This time it swung smooth and silent. There, should last another few years at least. Thank you. And the words felt inadequate. Can I pay you or feed you supper's pot roast tonight? Coffee's payment enough. He packed his tools methodically. Though I'll remember the pot roast offer. After he left, Ruth emerged from the pantry where she'd definitely not been hiding. Interesting man, Daniel Sawyer. He fixed the door, that's all. Of course, dear, just the door. The next morning, Margaret found herself watching for him with anticipation that had nothing to do with customer service. When he entered at exactly 8:30, she already had his coffee poured at his usual table. Efficient service, he noted, settling into his chair. Predictable customer, she countered, then wondered at her boldness. But he almost smiled, not quite, but close. Predictable? I suppose I am. Nothing wrong with knowing what you want. This time he did smile, just a slight lift of one corner of his mouth. No, I suppose not. As she turned to go, he spoke again. That quote yesterday, Emerson, you said it like you meant it. She looked back at him. Maybe I'm trying to... Good, he said simply, opening his book. It suits you. The morning continued its usual pattern, but Margaret felt something had shifted. Subtle as the door's new silence, she served other customers, refilled coffee cups, took orders, but remained aware of Daniel's presence in the corner. Once, she caught him watching her over his book. He didn't look away, just nodded slightly and returned to reading. He's sweet on you, Josiah Mills announced during lunch, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Margaret nearly dropped the plate she was carrying. I don't know what you mean. Daniel Sawyer. Haven't seen him look at anything that interested him since Sarah died. Josiah cut into his steak with satisfaction. About time. Mr. Mills, Josiah, you're mistaken. Maybe. But I've known that boy since he was knee-high. Never known him to fix anything for anyone he didn't care about. Margaret escaped to the kitchen, her face burning. Through the serving window, she could see Daniel's empty table. He'd left while she was distracted, but the memory of his quiet presence lingered. That evening, as she helped Ruth close the restaurant, Margaret found herself at the window watching the street. Daniel's horse was tied outside the general store, a beautiful bay mare with a white blaze. She watched him emerge with supplies, the way he checked the horse's hooves before mounting, how he adjusted the saddlebags with careful attention. He must have sensed her watching because he looked up, directly at the restaurant window. Even from a distance, she could see him touch his hat brim before riding away. He's a good man, Ruth said from behind her. Lonely, but good. Margaret let the curtain fall back. I'm not looking for a man, good or otherwise. I know, dear. Sometimes they find us anyway. That night in her small room, Margaret thought about Daniel's words about being yourself in a world trying to make you something else. She'd come west to become Harold Brennan's wife, to be what her family thought she should be. Now she was becoming something else entirely, a woman who worked hard, who earned her own way, who quoted philosophy with a quiet cowboy over morning coffee. Maybe Daniel Sawyer watched her, maybe she watched him back. Maybe that was all right. For now, it was enough to know that someone saw her, not the desperate woman who'd stepped off the stage, not the spinster her family pitied, but Margaret O'Brien, who made good cornbread and remembered how people took their coffee. Tomorrow he'd come at 8:30, take the corner table, read his book. She'd pour his coffee, black, and maybe they'd exchange a few words. Small things, ordinary things, but somehow full of possibility she hadn't expected to feel again. The lamp burned low as she prepared for bed, and through her window, the stars spread across the prairie sky like promises waiting to be kept. Monday morning arrived with Daniel carrying something unusual, a large tin bucket filled with prairie roses, their pink petals still damp with dew. He stood in the restaurant doorway, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Morning, Daniel?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, trying not to stare at the flowers. "Those are beautiful." "They're taking over the north pasture," he said, setting the bucket on the nearest table. "Thought maybe you could use them. For the tables. Place could use some color." Margaret touched one delicate bloom, breathing in its sweet scent. "The whole north pasture." "Well," he shifted his weight. "The part near the creek. Anyway." Ruth emerged from the kitchen, took one look at the situation, and disappeared again with what sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said, lifting the bucket. "I'll find some jars for them." "Need help." She almost refused. She'd been managing everything alone for nearly a month now. But something in his voice, tentative and hopeful, changed her mind. "The mason jars are on the high shelf in the pantry." He followed her into the kitchen, ducking slightly through the doorway he'd fixed last week. The space felt smaller with him in it, his presence filling the corners where usually only she and Ruth worked. He reached the shelf easily, bringing down a dozen jars. "Sarah loved these roses," he said suddenly, then stopped, as if surprised by his own words. Margaret kept her hands busy, trimming stems with kitchen shears. "Tell me about her." For a long moment, only the snip of shears broke the silence. Then, quietly, "She was nothing like you." Margaret's hands stilled. "Oh, that came out wrong." He set down the last jar, frowning. "I meant she was delicate, like these roses, pretty but fragile. Always worried about her health, even before the fever. He gestured vaguely. Sturdy. Sturdy." She couldn't help but smile at that. "Like a good fence post. Like something that lasts." His ears reddened. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" "Talking. Sarah did most of it for both of us." Margaret arranged roses in jars, considering her words. "You're doing fine. Besides, I've been called worse than sturdy." "By Harold Brennan." The name came out sharp. "Among others." She filled the jars with water, one by one. "My family, mainly. Too big, too plain, too particular. At least sturdy sounds useful." "You're not—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Brennan's a fool." Before Margaret could respond, the bell jangled and early customers began arriving. Daniel retreated to his corner table, book in hand, while Margaret distributed the flower jars throughout the dining room. Each table now held a spot of pink beauty, transforming the plain space into something softer. "Trying to fancy us up?" Josiah Mills asked, eyeing the roses suspiciously. "Just adding some cheer, Josiah." Suppose it doesn't hurt anything." But she caught him smiling at them when he thought she wasn't looking. The morning passed normally until Daniel stood to leave. As he counted out his coins, the knife on his belt caught the table edge, jerking open and slicing across his palm. Blood welled immediately, dripping onto the clean floor. "Damn," he muttered, grabbing a napkin. Margaret was beside him before she thought about it. "Let me see. It's nothing. It's bleeding all over my clean floor is what it is." She peeled back the napkin, examining the cut, deep but clean, across the meat of his palm. "Come on." She led him to the kitchen. Ignoring Ruth's raised eyebrows, her medical supplies were in the pantry: carbolic acid, clean muslin bandages, scissors, remnants from nursing her siblings through countless injuries. Sit. She pointed to the stool by the work table. I can tend it myself. With your left hand, sit. He sat. She pulled another stool close, cradling his injured hand in both of hers. The carbolic acid made him hiss through his teeth, but he held still while she cleaned the wound thoroughly. You've done this before, he observed, watching her work. 6 younger siblings. Remember? Someone was always bleeding. She laid clean muslin over the cut, began wrapping it carefully. Tommy split his chin on the well pump. Mary caught her arm on barbed wire. Peter put a pitchfork through his foot. That one was awful. You miss them? The question surprised her. Sometimes, not enough to go back in shame. Though, she secured the bandage, realizing she was still holding his hand. They both seemed to notice at the same moment the warmth of skin against skin, the way her thumb rested against his wrist where his pulse beat steady and strong. The kitchen went very quiet. Then Ruth coughed in the doorway, breaking the spell. I should go, Daniel said, pulling back carefully. Thank you. Keep it clean. Come back in 2 days. I'll change the bandage. He nodded, grabbed his hat, and left without his usual farewell. Margaret busied herself cleaning up the medical supplies, very aware of Ruth's silent observation. Not a word, Margaret warned. Wouldn't dream of it, dear. But 2 mornings later, Ruth wasn't able to tease anyone about anything. Margaret found her mentor burning with fever, barely conscious in her bed above the restaurant. Just a chill, Ruth mumbled through chattering teeth. I'll be fine by lunch. You'll be fine when you're fine, and not before. Margaret felt Ruth's forehead, alarmed by the heat. I'm closing the restaurant today. Can't lose the business. Then I won't close it. But you're staying in bed. Margaret flew down the stairs, her mind racing. She could manage breakfast alone, maybe lunch if she kept it simple. But Ruth needed tending, and there was so much work. Daniel walked in at his usual time, took one look at her face, and stood straighter. What's wrong? Ruth's sick. Fever. I need to manage everything alone today. And what do you need? She almost cried at the simple question. I don't know. Everything. Someone to watch Ruth while I cook, or someone to cook while I watch Ruth. I can't. You can. He moved past her into the kitchen, surveying the setup. I helped Sarah's mother run her boarding house one summer. I can manage eggs and bacon. You tend Ruth. You don't have to. Margaret. He turned, fixing her with those steady brown eyes. Let me help. She nodded, tears threatening. Thank you. The day became a blur. Daniel, despite his bandaged hand, proved competent in the kitchen. Not fancy, but the food was hot and filling. Margaret ran between Ruth's room and the dining room, serving customers who seemed understanding about the limited menu. She kept pushing beef broth and willow bark tea into Ruth, changing the cool cloths on her forehead, adjusting the warming pan at her feet when chills shook her. By evening, Ruth's fever had broken, though she remained weak. Margaret found Daniel scrubbing the last pot, the kitchen otherwise spotless. You stayed all day, she said wonderingly. You needed help. He dried his hands. She noticed he'd kept the bandage dry. How is she? Better. The fever broke. Margaret slumped against the doorframe, exhausted. I can't thank you enough. You don't need to. He hung the dish towel carefully. You should eat something. You haven't all day. She realized he was right. She'd been too worried to think about food. He pulled out a chair, gentle but insistent, and put a plate in front of her. Beef and gravy, biscuits from this morning, some of the canned peaches from the pantry. You need air too, he said when she'd eaten. Walk with me, just to the corner and back. I should stay with Ruth. She's sleeping. You checked 10 minutes ago. Come on. The evening was cool, stars just beginning to show. They walked slowly, Margaret's exhaustion making her unsteady. Without asking. Daniel offered his arm. She took it, too tired to worry about appearances. Sarah's fever came like that, he said quietly. Fast, hot. I rode through a blizzard trying to get the doctor. Ruth said you blamed yourself. I was gone 3 days, checking cattle at the winter pasture. If I'd been home, you couldn't have known. No. But guilt doesn't care about logic. He stopped walking, looking up at the stars. The fever took her in 2 days. Doctor said nothing would have helped. But I still wonder. Margaret squeezed his arm gently. I'm sorry. It's been 2 years. The wondering gets quieter. He looked down at her. Ruth will be fine. You got the fever down quick. I was so scared. She's been everything to me here. I know. They resumed walking. But you're stronger than you think. You'd have managed even without me. Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to. They reached the corner and turned back. Above them, the Big Dipper hung bright and clear. Daniel pointed out Polaris, the steady star that never moved. Sarah loved the stars, he said. Knew all the stories. That's Cassiopeia there, the vain queen. And Orion, the hunter. My father just called them God's lanterns, Margaret said. Practical man. Both ways work. At the restaurant door, she turned to face him. Daniel, truly thank you for everything today. That's what neighbors do. He touched his hat brim, started to leave, then turned back. I'll come early tomorrow. Help with breakfast before I head to the ranch. You don't need to. Margaret. His voice was soft but firm. You helped me once. Let me return it. She thought of his bandaged hand, her automatic response to his need. All right, he almost smiled. Get some rest. Ruth will need you strong tomorrow. As she climbed the stairs to check on Ruth one more time, Margaret realized something had changed between them. They'd moved from careful observation to something else, partnership. Maybe the beginning of trust. Daniel had seen her desperate and overwhelmed, and hadn't judged or diminished her. He'd simply helped, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ruth was sleeping peacefully, her breathing easy. Margaret adjusted the blankets, added wood to the small stove, and finally sought her own bed. Through her window, the stars Daniel had named spread across the sky, steady lights in the darkness, like the quiet presence of a man who noticed when someone needed help and gave it without keeping score. Tomorrow would bring more work, more worry until Ruth fully recovered, but Daniel would be there early, ready to help. The thought warmed her more than any warming pan could, a small flame of hope in her carefully guarded heart. October arrived with deceptive warmth, the kind that made folks forget winter's harsh promise. Margaret had just finished the lunch dishes when old Murphy burst through the door, his face red with excitement and exertion. Storm coming, he announced to the half-empty dining room. Cattle are bunching, and my rheumatism's screaming. Big one. Mark my words. Josiah Mills looked up from his coffee. It's barely October. Murphy, tell that to the storm. Murphy grabbed the door frame as wind gusted, rattling the windows. I seen the clouds building over Devil's Peak, black as judgment. Within an hour, the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees. Ruth, recovered from her fever but still weak, stood at the window watching the sky darken to an ominous yellow-gray. We need to prepare, she said quietly. October blizzards are the worst, nobody's ready. Margaret had lived through Missouri winters, but the urgency in Ruth's voice made her nervous. What do we need? Everything. Storm shutters up, coal brought in, water barrels filled, pipes freeze fast, extra food prepared in case we're snowed in for days. Ruth started for the stairs, swayed slightly. You're going to bed, Margaret said firmly. Tell me what needs doing, and I'll handle it. You can't possibly. The door opened again, bringing a blast of Arctic air and Daniel Sawyer. He took in the situation at a glance, Ruth pale and unsteady, Margaret already tying on her heavy apron. Storm shutters are in the shed, he said without preamble. I'll get them up. Margaret, fill everything that holds water. Ruth, get upstairs before you fall down. Ruth opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. The coal bin needs filling. There are quilts in the storage room, and candles. I know where everything is, Daniel interrupted gently. Go rest. After Ruth retreated upstairs, Margaret and Daniel worked with focused efficiency. She filled pots, buckets, even the spare wash basins with water while he hauled in coal, his shoulders straining against the weight. The wind grew stronger, whistling through gaps in the walls, carrying the first hard pellets of snow. These storms, Daniel said, wrestling a shutter into place. They come fast and mean. Temperature drops 40 degrees in an hour sometimes. Margaret helped him lift the next shutter, her hands already numb from the cold. How long do they last? Could be hours, could be days. He hammered the shutter secure. Best to prepare for the worst. They barely got the last shutter fastened before the storm hit in earnest. The wind slammed into the building like a physical force, making the whole structure groan. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, creating instant drifts against anything that stood still. Your horse, Margaret said suddenly. You need to get home. Already stabled her at Patterson's livery. Daniel secured the door with the heavy wooden bar. Figured I'd better stay. Help you through this. The implications of that, a night unchaperoned, flickered between them. Then another gust shook the building, rendering propriety meaningless against survival. Margaret lit the lamps while Daniel built up the fire in the pot-belly stove. The familiar dining room transformed in the flickering light, becoming a cave of warmth in the howling wilderness outside. She brought quilts from storage, spreading them on the floor near the stove. We should eat, she said practically. While the food's still good, they assembled a meal from what was ready: cold roast beef, bread, pickled vegetables, apple pie. The storm raged louder, making conversation difficult, so they ate in companionable silence. When the wind occasionally died, the sudden quiet was almost more unnerving than the noise. I should check on Ruth, Margaret said. I'll go. Daniel stood, then stopped. Thank you for not being scandalized about me staying. Don't be ridiculous. You could hardly ride out in this. He climbed the stairs, returning shortly. She's sleeping soundly. The room's warm enough. They settled by the stove, sitting on quilts with their backs against overturned chairs. Margaret had brought down playing cards and one of Ruth's bottles of whiskey for medicinal purposes. Ruth always said, "Do you play?" Margaret asked, shuffling the worn deck. Poker, rummy. My mother didn't approve of gambling. They played several hands, the cards a distraction from the storm's fury. The windows, despite the shutters, showed frost forming in intricate patterns. The lamplight flickered when particularly strong gusts hit. Your turn, Daniel said, then noticed her distraction. What is it? Just remembering another storm. I was 15, watching through the window for my father. He'd gone to town for supplies. She laid down her cards. He never came home. They found him frozen a mile from our farm. Daniel's hand covered hers briefly. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but storms still make me nervous. You don't show it. She laughed softly. I'm very good at not showing things. My family called it being stubborn. What else did they call you? The question was gentle, but she heard the edge underneath. He remembered her comment about Harold Brennan. Margaret poured them each a small measure of whiskey, needing the courage it might bring. Too plain, too plump, too particular. My mother, before she died, said I'd need to lower my standards if I wanted to marry. My sisters, all married by 18, agreed. So you answered Harold's advertisement. He seemed educated, established. His letters were... She sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn. I thought they were romantic. Turns out he was just good with words on paper. In person, He looked at me like I was livestock that didn't meet specifications. Bastard. The word came out low, fierce. Maybe. Or maybe he was just honest about what he wanted. No. Daniel turned to face her fully. Honesty doesn't require cruelty. He could have sent you away with dignity and tact. They sat quietly while wind shrieked around the corners of the building. The stove's heat created a small circle of comfort, the rest of the room lost in shadow. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel asked suddenly. "About Sarah." Margaret nodded, sensing the weight of coming revelation. "Everyone talks about how perfect she was, how tragic her death. And it was tragic she was 23, full of life." He stared into the stove's glow. "But our marriage, it wasn't what people thought." Margaret waited, not pushing. She loved the idea of me more than the reality. The strong, silent rancher who'd protect her from everything harsh in the world. But ranching is harsh. Life is harsh. She wanted me to be something I wasn't: softer, more social, more willing to give up the ranch and move to Denver where her sister lived. He picked up the poker, adjusting the coals unnecessarily. When she got sick, her last words were about how I'd failed her, how she'd wasted her youth on a man who cared more about cattle than culture. Daniel. The guilt isn't just that I wasn't there. It's that part of me was relieved when the fighting ended. His voice dropped to almost nothing. What kind of man feels relief when his wife dies? Margaret thought carefully before answering. An honest one. You can grieve someone and still acknowledge the truth of what was. Most people wouldn't see it that way. I'm not most people. She touched his arm lightly. My parents' marriage was miserable. When my father died, my mother cried for 3 days, then never mentioned him again. She was happier as a widow than she'd ever been as a wife. That's honesty, too. Daniel caught her hand, holding it between both of his. You're nothing like anyone expects you to be. Neither are you. The storm chose that moment to intensify, something crashing against the building, probably a tree branch. They both startled, then laughed at their reaction. Daniel didn't release her hand. I see you, Margaret, he said quietly, the words almost lost in the wind. Not what others expect, but who you are, strong and kind and real. She felt tears prick her eyes. Nobody's ever really seen me before. Then they were fools. He pulled her closer, just holding her against his side while the storm raged. She fit there perfectly, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder. They didn't speak for a long time, just existed in the warm circle of light while winter tried to devour the world outside. Tell me about your ranch, she said eventually. So he did, describing the valley where it sat, the creek that ran year-round, the meadows that turned gold in summer. His voice painted pictures of sunrise over the mountains, cattle moving like shadows through morning mist, the satisfaction of a well-built fence or a healthy calf. She could see it all, feel his love for the land in every word. You'd like it, he said. It's quiet but not lonely. Isolated but not empty. It sounds perfect. It needs work. The house, especially Sarah, hated it. Said it was too primitive. Just 3 rooms and a loft. Nothing fancy. Fancy is overrated. Solid matters more. He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest where her head rested. Sturdy. You mean? Exactly. They dozed fitfully through the night, waking when the wind changed pitch or the fire needed tending. Once. Margaret woke to find Daniel watching her, his expression unguarded in the dim light. What? Just thinking how different this is. Sarah would have been hysterical in a storm like this. You just handle it. Years of practice handling things. That's not all it is. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You have courage most people never find. Dawn came slowly, the storm exhausting itself as the sky lightened from black to gray. They stood stiffly, joints protesting the night on the floor, and peered through a crack in the shutters. The world had transformed. Snow drifted to the window's halfway point, the street completely obscured. "We're snowed in proper," Daniel observed. "It'll take hours to dig out." Margaret started to move away, propriety reasserting itself with daylight, but he caught her hand. "Margaret, last night, you don't have to say anything." "Yes, I do." He turned her to face him. I haven't wanted to feel anything for 2 years. Then you arrived, and suddenly I'm fixing doors and bringing flowers and staying through blizzards." "Daniel, I'm not good at this. Sarah was my first and only courtship, and that was arranged by our families. I don't know how to—" He stopped, frustrated. "I just know I want to keep seeing you, really seeing you. If you'll let me." Margaret looked at this man who'd sat through the storm with her, who'd shared his deep guilt and held her while the wind howled, who saw her as nobody else had. "I'll let you," she said simply. His smile transformed his face, years dropping away. "Good. That's good." Ruth's voice drifted down from upstairs. "If you two are done with your revelations, I could use some coffee." They jumped apart, Margaret's face flaming. Daniel actually grinned and went to dig out enough of the door to reach the water pump. Margaret busied herself with the stove, but her hands trembled slightly. Everything had changed in the night. The storm had stripped away pretense, leaving only truth. She'd been seen, truly seen, and hadn't been found wanting. It terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. As coffee brewed and the sun broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered world in diamond brilliance, Margaret understood that some storms didn't destroy, they cleared away what was dead, making room for something new to grow. 2 weeks after the blizzard, Willow Creek had settled into the drowsy calm of late October. The snow had melted except in the deepest shadows, and life resumed its familiar patterns. Margaret and Daniel had fallen into a new rhythm. Morning coffee came with conversation, evening walks when time permitted, and Sunday afternoons spent reading together in the restaurant after closing. Ruth watched it all with knowing smiles, but said nothing beyond occasional humming of wedding tunes. Margaret was refilling the salt cellars on a Thursday afternoon when the door opened, bringing voices she didn't immediately recognize. She looked up from her work and froze. Harold Brennan stood in the doorway, immaculate in a new wool suit, his arm linked with that of a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19. She was everything Margaret wasn't: petite, delicate-featured, with pale blonde hair arranged in elaborate curls beneath a fashionable bonnet. Her traveling dress was store-bought, the kind advertised in catalogs from Denver, deep blue silk with jet buttons. "This is the place," Harold announced to his companion, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Quaint, isn't it? Arabella, nothing like the establishments in Denver, but it serves its purpose for a town like this." Arabella tittered, a sound like breaking china. "Oh, Harold, you're terrible. I think it's charming in a rustic sort of way." They chose a table in the center of the room, impossible to ignore. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her order pad, but she forced herself to walk over with measured steps. Several regular customers watched with undisguised interest. Josiah Mills lowered his newspaper. Mrs. Patterson's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her voice steady. "What can I get for you today?" Harold looked up, and she saw the exact moment recognition dawned. His eyes widened, then narrowed with something like satisfaction. Well, Miss O'Brien, still here, I see. Mrs. Holloway was kind enough to offer me employment." Margaret kept her tone professionally neutral. "The menu is on the board. Today's special is beef stew." "How appropriate." Harold's emphasis on the word made it clear he meant the opposite. "Arabella, darling. This is the woman I told you about, from Missouri, the one who misrepresented herself." Arabella's gaze traveled over Margaret with the casual cruelty of youth. "Oh, Harold, you were right to be selective. Standards are so important, aren't they? Indeed. Harold leaned back in his chair, playing to their audience. You can't blame a man for having particular requirements. When one advertises for a wife, one expects truth in the correspondence. Wouldn't you agree, Miss O'Brien? Margaret felt heat climb her neck but kept her expression calm. I found that truth often depends on perspective. Mr. Brennan. Now, what would you like to order? Perspective. Harold laughed, the sound sharp as winter ice. That's rich. I suppose from your perspective, describing yourself as pleasantly figured when you're clearly... He gestured vaguely at her body. Well, that's a matter of perspective. Harold. Arabella giggled, slapping his arm playfully. You're being naughty. Just honest, darling. Something I value highly after my previous experience. He looked around the restaurant, ensuring everyone was listening. You see, Arabella comes from a good family in Denver. The Weatherbys, perhaps you've heard of them. No misrepresentation there. Her father owns 3 mines. How wonderful for you both, Margaret said quietly. The stew. Then, actually, Harold continued, ignoring her question. I brought Arabella here specifically. I wanted her to see the kind of establishment where a woman might end up when she aims too high. A cautionary tale, you might say. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Margaret felt every eye upon her, the familiar burn of humiliation threatening to overwhelm her. But this time, something was different. She'd survived these 2 weeks, earned these people's respect through honest work. She'd been held through a blizzard by a man who saw her truly. The only cautionary tale here, a deep voice said from the corner, is about men who mistake cruelty for cleverness. Daniel rose from his table, moving with the controlled grace Margaret had come to recognize meant carefully contained anger. He didn't approach Harold's table, didn't need to. His presence filled the space, solid and unmovable as the mountains. Mr. Sawyer, Harold's voice pitched slightly higher. This doesn't concern you. No. Daniel picked up his coffee cup, walked slowly to the counter where Margaret stood. Seems to me a man insulting a lady in public concerns every decent person present. Lady, Harold scoffed. That's generous. That's accurate. Daniel set his cup down with deliberate care. Miss O'Brien serves this community with grace and dignity. She works honest hours for honest wages. She tends the sick, feeds the hungry, and treats everyone with respect, even those who don't deserve it. He turned to face Harold fully. You, on the other hand, rejected a fine woman for shallow reasons, publicly humiliated her, and now return to gloat with your child bride. Tell me, Brennan, which one of you has shown true quality? Arabella gasped. How dare you speak to Harold that way? Do you know who my father is? Don't know, don't care. Daniel moved to Margaret's table, placing his hat there with deliberate intention. Miss O'Brien, I believe we have plans this evening. I'll wait while you finish with these. Customers. The implication was clear. Margaret was spoken for, protected, valued. She felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Now, see here. Harold started to rise, but Josiah Mills stood first. Best sit back down. Brennan? The old rancher's voice carried quiet authority. You've said enough. Mrs. Patterson stood as well. Margaret, dear, could you bring me more coffee? And perhaps Mr. Brennan and his fiancée would be more comfortable dining elsewhere. The hotel, perhaps. One by one, the regular customers began standing or turning their backs to Harold's table. It wasn't dramatic or aggressive, just a quiet, collective dismissal. The message was clear. Margaret belonged here. Harold didn't. This is ridiculous, Harold sputtered. We came for a meal. Then order or leave, Ruth said from the kitchen doorway. Margaret hadn't even heard her come down. But you'll speak respectfully to my staff, or you won't be served. Harold's face flushed deep red. Come, Arabella. We don't need to associate with these people. But Harold, I'm hungry, Arabella whined. We've been traveling all morning. The hotel serves food, Daniel said mildly. Though I hear their cook quit last week. Something about the owner's nephew being insufferable. A ripple of quiet laughter went through the room. Harold grabbed Arabella's arm, steering her toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back. You've all been taken in, he announced. She's not what she pretends to be. Neither are you, Margaret said, finding her voice at last. I pretended to be prettier than I am. You pretended to be a gentleman. I'd say my deception was far less harmful. Harold's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Arabella tugged his arm, and they left, the door slamming behind them. The restaurant stayed quiet for a moment. Then Josiah Mills cleared his throat. Margaret, about that coffee Mrs. Patterson wanted, might as well bring the pot. We'll all need refills. The spell broken. Conversation resumed with determined normalcy. Margaret moved through the room with the coffee pot, accepting shoulder pats and kind words with a full heart. When she reached Daniel's table, he caught her hand briefly. You all right? Yes. She was surprised to find it was true. I thought seeing him again would destroy me, but he just seemed small, petty. That's all he ever was. You just couldn't see it from inside the hurt. She squeezed his fingers before moving on. The afternoon continued normally. Customers coming and going, no one mentioning the scene they'd witnessed. But something had changed. Margaret felt it in the way people smiled at her, the extra warmth in their greetings. She'd been tested in public and hadn't broken. More than that, the town had chosen her side, near closing time. Daniel approached the counter where she was tallying receipts. About those plans I mentioned. We didn't have plans. We do now, he smiled slightly. Unless you object to being seen with me. Daniel Sawyer, you stood up for me in front of the entire town. You stood up for yourself. I just made sure you didn't have to do it alone. Margaret looked at this quiet man who'd become so essential to her days. Would you really have done something if Harold had persisted? Nothing violent, Daniel assured her. But I know things about Harold Brennan, about certain gambling debts in Denver, about why he really needed a wife with money, information his new father-in-law might find interesting. You investigated him. After the blizzard, sent some telegrams to friends in Denver. He shrugged. Wanted to know what kind of man would hurt you that way. And a weak one, the kind who needs to step on others to feel tall. Daniel touched her hand again. He can't hurt you anymore, Margaret. Not unless you let him. That evening, as they walked along the creek path outside town, Margaret felt lighter than she had in months. Harold's appearance had been a test, and she'd passed it. Not by being prettier or thinner or different than she was, but by being exactly herself, sturdy, capable, worthy of respect. Thank you, she said suddenly. For today. For everything since I arrived. Really. You don't need to thank me. I do. You've helped me see myself differently. Not as the woman who wasn't enough for Harold Brennan, but as someone who deserves better than Harold Brennan. Daniel stopped walking, turned to face her. You deserve everything, Margaret. A home, a family, a man who sees your worth. Don't settle for less. I won't, she promised, understanding the question beneath his words. Not anymore. They walked back as stars emerged, Harold's visit already fading like a bad dream upon waking. What remained was stronger, the knowledge that she'd built something real here. Respect. Friendship. Possibly love. Harold had tried to shame her with her past, but her present had proven more powerful. That night, as she prepared for bed, Margaret looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand. The same face looked background cheeks, plain features, nothing delicate or fashionable. But now she saw what Daniel saw, strength in her jaw, kindness in her eyes, capability in her hands. She was sturdy. Yes, and that was exactly what she needed to be. Tomorrow, Harold would presumably leave town with his ornamental bride. But Margaret would remain, serving coffee and comfort, building her life meal by meal, day by day, with a quiet cowboy who thought she deserved everything. And for the first time in her life, she believed he might be right. November arrived with crystalline mornings and golden afternoons, the kind of weather that made the prairie glow like hammered copper. Margaret had just finished the breakfast cleanup when Ruth asked her to sit down in the kitchen, a request unusual enough to cause concern. "Are you feeling ill again?" Margaret touched Ruth's forehead automatically. "No, dear, I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." Ruth poured them both coffee, her movements deliberate. "I've been thinking about the future." "The future. I'm 63 years old. Margaret, these old bones are tired. The fever last month showed me that plainly." Ruth wrapped her hands around her cup. "I've been running this place for 23 years. It's time for a change." Margaret's stomach dropped. "You're not closing the restaurant?" "No, no, nothing like that." Ruth smiled. "I'm thinking of retiring, moving to my sister's place in Colorado Springs. She's been asking for years. But the restaurant would need a new owner." Ruth's eyes held Margaret steadily. "Someone who knows the business, who the customers trust, who's proven herself capable." Margaret stared at her. "Ruth, I couldn't possibly." "Why not?" "I don't have money to buy it." "Did I mention selling?" Ruth leaned forward. "Margaret, thou came here with nothing but hurt and $20. In 2 months, thou has become essential to this place. The customers ask for thy cornbread specifically. Thou handled the October blizzard better than I would have. Thou has earned this." "Ruth," Margaret's voice broke. "There are conditions," Ruth continued briskly. "I'd stay through winter. Make sure thou has everything well in hand. The building is rented from Patterson, but he's already agreed to transfer the lease. There's some savings for supplies and emergencies." She paused. "And I think thou should have a partner. Running a restaurant alone is brutal work." "A partner?" Ruth's smile turned knowing. "A husband, perhaps. Someone steady, reliable. Someone who's already proven he'll show up when needed." Margaret's face heated. "Ruth Holloway, you're matchmaking." "I'm being practical. Daniel Sawyer is a good man who looks at thee like thou hung the moon. Thou looks back the same way. Why waste time pretending otherwise? It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." Ruth stood, smoothing her apron. "Life is short. Margaret, I had 18 good years with my Abraham before the cholera took him. 18 years I wouldn't trade for anything. Don't let fear rob thee of joy." Before Margaret could respond, the bell jangled and Daniel entered. He looked different, cleaner than usual. His good shirt pressed, boots polished to a shine. He held his best hat, the one he'd placed on her table when confronting Harold. "Margaret." He seemed nervous. Unusual for him. Could you come for a ride this afternoon?" Ruth practically pushed Margaret toward him. "Go. I'll handle supper preparations." "But—" "Go," Ruth said firmly. "Some conversations can't happen in kitchens." An hour later, Margaret sat beside Daniel in his wagon, wearing her better dress, the green calico that brought out her eyes. They'd driven in comfortable silence through town and out toward his ranch, but he'd turned off the main road onto a smaller track that wound upward into the hills. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There's something I want to show you." His hands were tight on the reins, knuckles white. "A place I've been thinking about bringing you for weeks." The track opened onto a meadow that took Margaret's breath away. Below them, the valley spread out like a patchwork quilt. The town a small cluster of buildings. The creek winding silver through golden grass. The mountains rising purple and majestic in the distance. Sagebrush perfumed the air, and a meadowlark sang from a nearby juniper. Daniel helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist. This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch. Sarah never... He stopped. I've never brought anyone here. It's beautiful. In spring, it's covered with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, columbine, those roses you like. He led her to a flat rock that served as a natural bench. I come here when I need to think clearly. They sat watching the sun angle lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Margaret waited, sensing Daniel gathering himself for something important. My grandmother's ring, he said suddenly, pulling a small velvet pouch from his pocket. She brought it from Ireland, survived the crossing, the journey west. 50 years of ranch life. She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for a woman who had staying power. Margaret's breath caught as he opened the pouch, revealing a simple gold band with a small garnet, worn smooth by years of work and weather. Margaret. He turned to face her fully, and she saw his hands trembling. I'm not good with words. I'm set in my ways. Probably difficult to live with. I track mud through the house and forget to talk for hours at a time. I wake before dawn and smell like horses more often than not. Daniel. Let me finish, please. He took a breath. I'm also lonely. I've been lonely for longer than Sarah's been gone, if I'm honest. But these past 2 months, with you, I haven't been lonely. I've been seen, same as you have. He slid off the rock, going to one knee in the prairie grass. The traditional gesture from such an untraditional man made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. I'm not offering rescue, Margaret. You don't need rescuing. I'm asking for partnership with the strongest woman I know. Someone who faces blizzards without flinching, who stands up to bullies with dignity, who makes the best cornbread in the territory. His voice roughened. Someone I love true and deep, the way I never knew I could love until you stepped off that stage. Margaret's tears spilled over. Daniel, what if I'm not enough? What if you realize Harold was right? That I'm too plain, too... Stop. He caught her hands. Harold Brennan is a fool who mistook decoration for substance. You're not my second choice. Margaret, you're my only choice. The only woman I want to wake up beside, work alongside, grow old with. She looked at this good man kneeling before her, offering not just marriage but understanding, partnership, belonging. He'd seen her at her worst desperate, humiliated, exhausted, and still thought she was worth his grandmother's ring. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. But I'm more scared of living without you. Margaret touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw, the warmth of his skin. Ask me, Margaret O'Brien, will you marry me? The meadowlark sang again, the sound carrying across the valley. The sun touched the mountains, setting them ablaze. And Margaret, who'd traveled so far to marry the wrong man, found herself exactly where she needed to be. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Daniel Sawyer, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. Then he stood, pulling her up and into his arms, holding her like she was precious and unbreakable both. I love you, he said against her hair. I should have said that first. You've been saying it for weeks, with flowers and fixed doors and staying through storms. That's different than words. No, Margaret said, pulling back to look at him. It's better. Anyone can say words. Harold's letters were full of beautiful words. You showed me. He kissed her then, gentle and sure. And Margaret felt the last of her old self, the rejected woman. The family disappointment dissolve. In its place stood someone new, Margaret O'Brien, who was loved, who was chosen, who was enough. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had turned the whole sky orange and pink. Daniel spread a blanket from the wagon, and they sat together, Margaret tucked against his side, watching day transform into evening. Ruth's giving me the restaurant, she said eventually. What? She explained Ruth's offer, her plans to retire. Daniel listened thoughtfully. You should take it. You're brilliant at it. It's hard work, long hours, not much money. I have the ranch. We wouldn't starve. He paused. If you wanted to keep working after we're married, some men wouldn't like it, but I'm not some men. You'd really not mind. Margaret, you light up when you're cooking, when you're taking care of people. Why would I want to dim that light? She twisted the ring, watching the garnet catch the last sunlight. Your grandmother must have been remarkable. She was. Came from nothing, built a life through sheer will. Remind you of anyone. Margaret smiled. I'm not that strong. You left everything you knew, survived public humiliation, and built a new life in 2 months. That's not strong. When you put it that way. The house needs work, Daniel said suddenly. Sarah hated it, wanted something fancier, but I could add rooms, fix it up proper. Whatever you want. I don't need fancy. I need solid, sturdy. You mean? He was teasing now. Exactly. Sturdy houses for sturdy women. They stayed until full dark, planning quietly. A December wedding, simple and small. Keep the restaurant open, at least until children came. Fix up the ranch house room by room. Build a life together, meal by meal, season by season. When Daniel finally drove her back to town, stars thick as the homemade lace handkerchief in Margaret's pocket, a gift from her mother she'd carried all the way from Missouri, thinking to wear it at her wedding to Harold. Now it would serve its purpose for a different groom, a better man, a true partnership. Ruth was waiting in the kitchen, pretending to knead bread that clearly didn't need it. Well, she asked, though Margaret's tear-streaked, glowing face surely told the story. Margaret held up her left hand, the ring catching the lamplight. Oh, child. Ruth embraced her, flower transferring to Margaret's dress. I'm so happy for thee. December, Margaret said. Before you leave, will you stand with me? I'd be honored. Ruth pulled back, wiping her own eyes. Now, tell me everything. Every word. So Margaret did, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd learned to make biscuits, where she'd found sanctuary, where she'd discovered her own worth. She told Ruth about the meadow, the sunset, Daniel's trembling hands and honest words. He said, I'm not his second choice. Margaret said wonderingly, I'm his only choice. Of course thou is. That man has been choosing thee since the day thou arrived. He just needed time to admit it. I needed time too, to believe I was worth choosing. Ruth covered Margaret's hand, the ring warm between them. Thou was always worth choosing, dear. Thou just needed to find someone with eyes to see it. Later, lying in her narrow bed, Margaret held her hand up to catch the moonlight through the window. The ring was simple, even plain by Harold's standards. But it had survived an ocean crossing, decades of hard work, a lifetime of real love. It would survive whatever came next. Tomorrow she'd wake at 4:15, make biscuits and coffee, serve the people who'd become her community. But everything would be different now. She was Margaret O'Brien, engaged to Daniel Sawyer, future owner of Holloway's Dining House, citizen of Willow Creek. She'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to find love with another stranger who'd become essential. Life's patterns were mysterious, often painful, but sometimes they led you exactly where you needed to be. Through her window, she could see the lights of town, the stars above, and somewhere out there, the ranch where she'd build her future. The lamp in her window burned steady, a beacon of hope fulfilled, of love discovered, of home finally found. The first Saturday of December dawned clear and cold, frost painting every surface in crystalline white. Margaret stood in Ruth's room above the restaurant, wearing her mother's wedding dress carefully altered over the past 2 weeks to fit her fuller figure. The ivory silk had yellowed with age, but in the morning light it looked like cream, soft and warm. Hold still, Ruth commanded, pinning the last of the orange blossoms from the general store into Margaret's hair. There, perfect. Margaret looked in the mirror, hardly recognizing herself. Not beautiful, perhaps, but something better radiant with happiness. The past 3 months had changed her, carved away the shame and uncertainty, leaving someone stronger in their place. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Good. Means it matters." Ruth adjusted Margaret's mother's cameo at her throat. "Daniel's probably wearing a groove in the church floor pacing." A knock at the door interrupted them. Josiah Mills stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable but determined in his Sunday suit. "You clean up well, Josiah," Ruth said. "Don't get used to it." He cleared his throat, turning to Margaret. "I know I'm not your father, but I thought maybe you'd like someone to, well, to walk you down the aisle, if you want." Margaret's eyes filled. "Josiah, that's thank you. Yes. Good. Good." He fumbled with something in his pocket. "This is from the boys, my sons. They wanted you to have it." He produced a small silver horseshoe, polished to a shine. "For luck. Though I told them you don't need luck when you're marrying a good man." Margaret tucked the horseshoe into her bouquet of dried prairie roses and sage. "Tell them thank you." The walk to the church felt both endless and instant. The whole town seemed to have turned out, lining the street despite the cold. Mrs. Patterson threw rice. The widow Martinez's boys whooped and cheered, and even the banker tipped his hat. Margaret held Josiah's arm tighter, overwhelmed by the unexpected warmth from people who'd watched her arrival in disgrace and chosen to celebrate her joy instead. The church was simple whitewashed walls, pine pews, windows of plain glass that let in rivers of morning light. But many someones had decorated it with pine boughs and red ribbons, filling the space with the scent of evergreen and hope. Every pew was full, faces turned toward her with genuine pleasure. And there at the altar stood Daniel. He wore a black suit she'd never seen before, his hair carefully combed, boots shined. But it was his expression that stopped her breath, wonder and love and something like awe, as if he couldn't quite believe she was walking toward him. His eyes never left her face as Josiah led her down the aisle, and when the old rancher placed her hand in Daniel's, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. "You came," Daniel whispered. "Did you doubt?" "Never. Just, you're so beautiful." "Daniel Sawyer, are you feeling well?" His smile was answer enough. Reverend Thompson kept the ceremony simple, as they'd requested. The traditional words felt new when spoken to Daniel, when promised by him. Margaret had thought she'd cry, but instead felt a deep calm, a rightness that settled in her bones. When Daniel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, he'd insisted on buying new rings. Saying his grandmother's ring was her engagement gift, she saw his hands were steady now. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson announced. "You may kiss your bride." Daniel cupped her face gently, as if she were precious and breakable, though he knew better than anyone how strong she was. The kiss was soft, brief, appropriate for public viewing, but it promised more. The church erupted in cheers. Someone rang the bell, the sound carrying across the valley. As they walked back down the aisle, Margaret saw Ruth wiping tears, Josiah blowing his nose loudly, Mrs. Patterson smiling so wide it must have hurt. Outside, they were pelted with more rice and dried beans, the traditional prairie blessing for fertility and prosperity. Daniel helped Margaret into the decorated wagon someone had woven evergreen and ribbons through the wheels for the short ride to the restaurant and reception. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, helping her down at the restaurant, "how does it feel? Like coming home?" The restaurant had been transformed. Tables pushed together, covered with everyone's best tablecloths, mason jars filled with pine branches and dried flowers, and food the town had outdone itself with potluck offerings. Mrs. Patterson's 3-layer cake, Widow Martinez's tamales. Josiah's sons had even attempted cookies that were only slightly burned. "Speech," someone called out, and Daniel groaned. Go on, Margaret encouraged. They fed us. Least we can do is thank them. Daniel stood, pulling Margaret up beside him. I'm not good at speeches, he began, which earned knowing chuckles. But thank you, all of you, for welcoming Margaret when she needed it. For being here today. He stopped, looking at his wife. For seeing what I saw, even when she couldn't see it herself. My turn, Margaret said, surprising him. 3 months ago, I arrived here broken. I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. Ruth gave me work and dignity. This town gave me belonging. And Daniel. She turned to him. Daniel gave me myself. Thank you all for being our family. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The party continued into afternoon dancing to the two-man band of accordion and fiddle. Stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Children racing between tables stealing cookies. Harold Brennan's name was never mentioned, as if he'd been erased from the collective memory. As the sun angled low, Daniel caught Margaret's hand. Ready to go home. Home. The word thrilled through her. They said their goodbyes. Ruth hugging Margaret fiercely. Be happy, child. That's all I ask. I already am. The ride to the ranch was quiet, both of them absorbing the magnitude of the change. Married. The word felt foreign and familiar both, like a coat that needed wearing to fit properly. The ranch house came into view as the last sunlight touched the mountains. It was as Daniel had described, 3 rooms and a loft. Nothing fancy. But he'd been busy. The porch had been repaired. A new rocking chair beside his old one. Window boxes waited for spring planting, and every window glowed with lamplight. You lit all the lamps, wanted you to see it welcoming. He helped her down, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. Tradition, he said, carrying her over the threshold. The kitchen was warm, the stove already burning. New shelves lined one wall, ready for her dishes and preserves. A table and chairs, handmade and solid. And on the table, a coal oil lamp with a glass chimney etched with flowers. It was Sarah's grandmother's, Daniel said, setting Margaret down but keeping his arms around her. The only thing of hers I kept. Thought maybe new memories might heal old ones. Margaret touched the lamp gently. It's perfect. He showed her the rest of the bedroom with a new quilt from the church ladies spread across the bed. The third room he'd started converting to a pantry and workspace for her. The loft that could someday be a child's room. Everything simple but clean, waiting to be made into a home. I know it's not fancy, Daniel. She stopped his words with a kiss. It's exactly right. Later, they sat on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in quilts, watching stars emerge across the vast sky. Margaret's head rested on Daniel's shoulder, his arm secure around her. Are you happy? He asked quietly. I didn't know I could be this happy. Even though you're stuck on a ranch with a taciturn cowboy, especially because of that. She lifted her head to look at him. Daniel, can I tell you something? Anything. When I answered Harold's advertisement, I thought I was choosing safety, marriage to a respectable man, a proper house, a place in society. I thought that's what I needed. But that wasn't living. It was hiding. You. She touched his face. You see me. The real me. And somehow you love what you see. Not somehow. Completely. Desperately. He caught her hand. Kissed her palm. You saved me too. You know, I was disappearing. Bit by bit. Going through motions. Existing but not living. Then you arrived with your dignity and your courage, making terrible coffee. My coffee's improved. And suddenly I wanted to live again. Really live. They sat quietly, the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them, an owl calling, cattle lowing in the distance, wind through the sage. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, all the pain and humiliation that had led to this moment. She wouldn't change any of it, she realized. Every step had been necessary. "I want to light the lamp," she said suddenly, "in the kitchen window, like a beacon." For what? For home. So anyone passing knows this is a place of warmth and welcome. They went inside together, and Margaret lifted the chimney, struck a match. The wick caught, flame growing steady and bright. She adjusted it carefully, then placed the lamp in the window where its light would shine across the valley. Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood watching their reflection in the window, two people who'd found each other against all odds. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sawyer," he murmured against her hair. Margaret leaned back into his solid warmth, her hand covering his where it rested over her heart. "Welcome home, Mr. Sawyer." The lamp burned steadily, its light pushing back the darkness. Somewhere in town, Ruth was packing for Colorado, content that her legacy was in good hands. Somewhere, Harold Brennan lived with his ornamental wife, never knowing what he'd missed. And here, in a simple ranch house on the prairie, two people who'd thought themselves unworthy of love stood together, proving themselves wrong. Margaret turned in Daniel's arms, reaching up to touch his face. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for waiting for me, for choosing me." "Thank you," he replied, "for being brave enough to stay, for letting yourself be seen, for choosing me back." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in fresh white. But inside, the lamp burned bright, and love lived in every corner of the simple rooms. Margaret O'Brien Sawyer had traveled 1,000 miles to find home, only to discover that home wasn't a place, it was a person who saw your true self and loved you, not despite it, but because of it. As they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Margaret paused to look back at the kitchen, at the lamp glowing in the window. Tomorrow she'd wake in her own home, beside her husband, to begin their real life together. There would be challenges, harsh winters, lean years, the 1,000 difficulties of ranch life. But there would also be the certainty of being known, being loved, being home. The lamp would burn through the night, a promise to the darkness that here, in this place, love lived. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. I've told you Margaret's story because I needed you to understand something I learned late in my own life. Family isn't always blood, and home isn't always where you started. Sometimes the greatest gift is the rejection that sends you toward your true destination. Margaret thought she was writing to Harold Brennan about marriage, but she was really writing her way to Daniel Sawyer. She thought she was failing when she took Ruth's offer of work, but she was actually building the foundation of her real life. Every person who stood when Harold tried to shame her, every cup of coffee poured for a grieving widower, every night she chose to stay instead of run. These weren't just moments. They were stitches in the quilt of belonging. You see, gratitude isn't just saying thank you. It's recognizing that our disasters might be our deliverances. Margaret's humiliation became her liberation. Daniel's loneliness became his opening. Ruth's illness became the bridge between two careful hearts. The lamp still burns in that kitchen window, though Margaret and Daniel are long gone. Their grandchildren light it now, understanding what we all must learn: love isn't about being enough for someone else. It's about finding someone who sees you've always been enough, exactly as you are.